Have you ever gone to Mass on autopilot? You stand, you sit, you kneel, and somewhere between the opening hymn and the final blessing, your mind is running through grocery lists and Monday morning meetings, and you do not notice until you are already back in the parking lot clicking your seatbelt. And that is not a rare experience. That is most people's experience. Most Sundays, most years. And for Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the Capuchin friar who spent more than 50 years in a confessional box watching souls come and go, that was the specific spiritual crisis of the modern Catholic world. Not atheism, not open apostasy, not the dramatic abandonment of faith. The quiet, suffocating, imperceptible death of encounter, replaced by something that looks identical from the outside and has been hollowed out entirely from within. Have you ever gone to Mass on autopilot? You stand, you sit, you kneel, you say the words, you walk to the altar, receive the host, go back to your seat, and leave before the final hymn is done. Nothing felt wrong, nothing felt right either. Just routine. Just another Sunday. Padre Pio called that the most dangerous place a Catholic could occupy. Not hell, not doubt, but that gray, comfortable middle where the sacrament becomes a habit. He said it more than once, more than twice. He said it with the kind of gravity that made people stop breathing. And here's where it gets serious. Padre Pio was not a man who threw words around. He spent between 16 and 19 hours a day in the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo, a small town in the Gargano Mountains of southeastern Italy, from the early 1920s until just months before his death on September 23, 1968. He heard somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 confessions a year. Some estimates go higher. He had seen, personally and supernaturally, what the sacraments do to a soul when received with fire, and what they fail to do when received cold. He knew the difference, and he was not gentle about it. This is not a story about people who left the faith. This is a story about people who stayed and still got it terribly wrong. Because Padre Pio watched it happen over and over, in that wooden confessional box, in the faces that approached his altar, in the visions that came to him at night. He watched routine eat the sacrament alive from the inside, slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. If you value documented Catholic history and mystical theology like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. And drop a comment telling us what city you are listening from. Also, this script draws from two sources you will want to know. First, Bernard Ruffin's biography, Padre Pio. The true story, published by Our Sunday Visitor in 1991 and updated in 2001, which is considered the most academically rigorous English-language biography of the saint, built from primary Italian sources and direct witness depositions. And second, the Positio Super Virtutibus, the official Vatican documentation compiled during Padre Pio's beatification cause in the 1990s, which includes over 100 sworn testimonies from people who confessed to him or lived alongside him. These are not popular devotional pamphlets. These are sworn statements made under ecclesiastical oath. Now back to the story. Padre Pio was born Francesco Forgione on May 25th, 1887, in Pietrelcina, a small agricultural town in the Campania region of southern Italy. He entered the Capuchin order at 15, was ordained a priest in 1910, and by 1918 was already carrying the physical wounds of Christ, the stigmata, on his hands, feet, and side. Those wounds bled for 50 years. The blood lost from them was measured and documented by two different physicians, Dr. Luigi Romanelli in 1919 and Professor Giorgio Festa in 1920. Neither could explain it medically. The wounds never closed. They never became infected. The scent from them, witnesses described it as roses, violets, incense, was confirmed by the Jesuit priest Agostino Gemelli, who visited in 1920 and, despite his profound skepticism, could not deny it. But what interests us here is not the wounds. What interests us is what happened inside that confessional, because that is where Padre Pio saw routine up close. That is where he encountered it face to face, 5,000 times a year, and learned its smell. The confessional at Santa Maria delle Grazie in San Giovanni Rotondo became famous across Europe and the Americas. By the 1930s, people were traveling from Germany, the United States, Argentina, and Australia to confess to him. At one point, the waiting list for confession stretched to weeks, sometimes 15 days, sometimes a full month. The Capuchin community had to issue numbered tickets just to manage the crowd. There were arguments. There was pushing. One American journalist described the line in 1950 as stretching out of the church door and down the street in the southern Italian heat. Ordinary people and generals, peasant women and ambassadors, all waiting for the same small wooden box. Why? Because Padre Pio knew. People had experienced it firsthand. He knew your sins before you said them. He knew the ones you had forgotten. He knew the ones you were trying to hide. He knew which ones you had confessed already but had not truly repented. And he turned people away. He turned them away regularly. Not permanently, but he sent them back. He told them they were not ready. He told them to go and think again, to come back when they were serious. This is where the issue of routine hits hardest. Because among all the sins Padre Pio encountered, and he encountered everything, adultery, theft, violence, despair, the one that he returned to again and again in his homilies and private conversations, was the sin of going through the motions, receiving communion in a state of spiritual indifference, going to confession without genuine contrition, treating the body and blood of Christ like a box to tick on a Sunday schedule. He said it in the friary. He said it to his spiritual children. Father Raffaele de Dario, one of the Capuchin friars who lived alongside him for decades, documented it in his personal notes which were submitted as testimony during the beatification cause. He recalled Padre Pio saying, in the dialect that mixed Italian and the Old Neapolitan, that a soul which receives the Eucharist without recollection is like a man who invites a king into a room full of mud and then asks what the problem is. You opened the door, you said the words, but the house was not prepared. The word he used, recollection, is worth pausing on. In Catholic spiritual theology, recollection is not meditation in the general sense. It is a specific interior gathering of attention toward God before and during prayer and sacramental acts. The Catechism of the Council of Trent, written in 1566 under Pope Pius V, dedicates an entire section to the disposition required for worthy communion. St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae, specifically in the third part, question 80, article 9, lists spiritual indifference alongside sacrilege as the spectrum of damage done to the soul by unworthy reception, not just objectively grave sin, but the creeping damage of habitual coldness. Padre Pio knew this theology, he had studied it, but he did not talk about it the way a professor would. He talked about it the way a doctor talks about a disease he has watched kill dozens of patients, with urgency, with grief, with zero sentimentality. The first documented confrontation with routine in his ministry comes from 1922. A woman from the province of Foggia, her name is withheld in Ruffin's account at family request, but her case was confirmed by 2 friars present, came to San Giovanni Rotondo for confession. She was a practicing Catholic, attended Mass every Sunday without fail, monthly communion, Friday abstinence. She had been doing all of it for 30 years. She entered the confessional confident. She had a short list, small sins, nothing dramatic. Padre Pio stopped her within the first minute. He told her that the last 10 years of her confessions had been invalid, not because she had lied exactly, but because she had come to confession without true examination of conscience, had confessed the same surface sins by rote, and had never once genuinely confronted the core pride that structured her spiritual life. She had performed the sacrament. She had not received it. He said she needed to make a general confession, a complete reconfession going back a decade, and he would not absolve her until she had done the interior work required to make that confession real. She was devastated. She returned 3 days later. She made the general confession. Ruffin records that she wept through the entire thing, not from embarrassment, but from what she described to the friar afterward as the physical sensation of something loosening in her chest, like a knot she had not known was there. Padre Pio absolved her. She said she felt something she could not compare to any prior experience of the sacrament, even though she had been receiving it her entire adult life. This case was not unique. She was not the only one. She was not even unusual. In the same period, the early 1920s, a farmer from a village near Foggia came to confession and was told, gently but directly, that he had been confessing the same external sins for 11 years without ever once confessing the root beneath them. The root, Padre Pio told him, was a settled contempt for his own wife, which he had never named as sin because he had told himself it was simply a personality conflict, that it was just the way things were. Padre Pio told him that what he called personality conflict, God called a slow murder of the person he had promised to love. The man came back 2 weeks later, made a full confession, and according to the testimony of a friar who knew both of them, the marriage changed so dramatically that neighbors asked his wife what had happened to her husband. She told them he went to San Giovanni Rotondo and came home a different man. That testimony is referenced in the Positio, among the examples of the practical fruits of Padre Pio's confessional ministry. This case was not unique. It was a pattern. The friars around Padre Pio documented similar encounters across 4 decades. In 1937, a priest, not a layman, came for confession and was sent away. Padre Pio told him that he had been celebrating Mass for 14 years in a state of interior deadness, going through the ritual with technical precision but without the personal encounter with Christ that the Mass demands of the celebrant. The priest, whose identity was withheld in the beatification documents but whose testimony is cited in the Positio, said he initially left the confessional angry. He told a companion that he found Padre Pio presumptuous. Who was he to judge the interior state of another priest? He drove back to his diocese, still fuming, and then, over the following weeks, could not stop thinking about what had been said. He returned to San Giovanni Rotondo in 1939, confessed everything, was absolved. He later became one of the most active promoters of Padre Pio's cause for canonization and submitted his testimony to the Vatican himself. The mechanism behind Padre Pio's insight was what the Catholic tradition calls the charism of discernment of spirits, specifically the infused knowledge of the interior state of souls. St. Paul names it in 1 Corinthians 12 as one of the gifts distributed by the Holy Spirit. It is listed as distinct from prophecy, distinct from healing. It is the specific capacity to perceive what is spiritually real in a person beyond what their words or behavior reveal. In Padre Pio's case, this appears to have operated most powerfully in the confessional. Witnesses who were present near the box, not inside it, reported hearing him name sins that penitents had not yet spoken, hearing him address questions the person had not asked aloud, hearing him speak in a tone of urgency about things that seemed impossible to know. There is a documented exchange from 1944 that illustrates this with particular sharpness. A woman from Bari, named in the beatification positio only as Rosa T., had been a practicing Catholic her entire life. Mass every Sunday, monthly confession, rosary daily. She was devout by any observable measure. She had never committed any obvious mortal sin that she was aware of. She came to confession and presented what she described as a clean list. Padre Pio heard her for less than a minute before stopping her and asking her when she had last actually looked at the people in the pew beside her. She was confused. He asked again. He told her that for 20 years she had been attending Mass surrounded by people she actively despised, people she believed were beneath her, whose presence at the same altar she considered offensive, and had gone to communion carrying that contempt every single Sunday without ever identifying it as something that needed confessing. She had thought of herself as patient with them. Padre Pio said, very quietly, that patience with someone you secretly believe is inferior is not virtue, it is management. And she had been managing people for 20 years instead of loving them. That is what she had brought to the altar. Every Sunday, for 2 decades, she broke down. She described it to the friar outside afterward as a mirror being turned toward a face she had never seen before. She returned the following week and made a general confession going back 20 years. She said that the first communion she received after that confession tasted, in her words, completely different. She could not explain it any other way. It tasted different. The friar who recorded this noted that it was a description he had heard from multiple people across multiple years after Padre Pio's confessional interventions. Not the same words, but the same structure. Something changed. Something that had been absent was suddenly present. The sacrament was the same sacrament they had been receiving for decades. But now the window was open. Dr. Giuseppe Sala of Milan, who confessed to Padre Pio in 1953 and whose written account is part of the permanent archive at the Capuchin Friary, records that before he could open his mouth, Padre Pio said to him quietly that he had been holding a specific resentment against his brother for 11 years, had confessed the external acts attached to that resentment, but had never confessed the resentment itself, that the resentment was still alive, and that every communion received while that resentment remained alive and unconfessed had been received in a state of interior disorder. Dr. Sala wrote that he was stunned. He had not thought of it as something that needed confessing. It was just a feeling. It was private. He had managed it. But Padre Pio told him that managing a wound is not the same as healing it, and that the sacraments are not management tools. They are medicine. And medicine does not work if the patient keeps the wound covered. That phrase, medicine does not work if the patient keeps the wound covered, appears in at least 3 separate testimonies from different people who confessed to him at different times. It is not attributed to a single documented quote with a date and a witness. It appears to be something he said often, something that came back to the people who heard it and stuck. The Positio documents it as a recurring expression associated with his confessional ministry. Now, what exactly did Padre Pio mean when he said the sacrament could be suffocated by routine? He was not saying it stopped existing. The theology here matters. In Catholic teaching, a sacrament validly administered and received does what it does by the power of Christ, not by the emotion of the recipient. The Eucharist is the Eucharist whether you feel anything or not. Baptism saves whether the infant cries or sleeps. This is the doctrine of ex opere operato. By the work, worked. Padre Pio knew this perfectly well. He was not contradicting it. What he was pointing to was something else, something the theologians call the disposition of the recipient, the interior openness or closedness that determines how much of the sacrament's fruit is actually received by the soul. A sacrament validly received in cold indifference is still a sacrament, but the fruit of that sacrament or the actual increase of grace, the deepening of union with Christ, the movement toward transformation is proportional to the preparation and openness brought to it. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote exactly this in the Summa Part 3, question 69, Article 8. The grace is not blocked, but its operation in the soul can be impeded, the way a window can be present but covered. The light real, but not getting through. Padre Pio was pointing at the covered window. That is what routine does. It does not remove the sacrament. It covers the window. Year by year, Sunday by Sunday, reception by reception, the glass gets a little more opaque. And the tragedy is that the person on the other side can barely tell it is happening, because they are still showing up. They are still doing the right things. They are still receiving. They just stopped expecting anything. They stopped noticing. The sacrament became wallpaper, present, correct, invisible. He described this to Padre Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, one of his most important Capuchin correspondents, in a letter from the early 1920s. The correspondence between them was preserved and later published in Italian as Epistolario Volume 1, available from Edizioni Padre Pio da Pietrelcina in San Giovanni Rotondo. He wrote that the soul that approaches the sacraments with tepidity is like someone who opens a gift, looks at the wrapping, and then sets it on a shelf unopened. The gift is real. The giving was real. But nothing was received. He called tepidity in sacramental life one of the great tragedies invisible to the human eye. If you are still with this, subscribe. This kind of documented deep dive into Catholic mystical history is what this channel is built on. What city are you coming from? Drop it in the comments. Padre Pio was not soft about what tepidity costs. In the confessional, he was known for sternness, for bluntness that shocked people who expected gentle reassurance. This was not cruelty. It was the opposite. Padre Clemente Vona, a Capuchin friar who served alongside him and submitted extensive testimony during the beatification process, described Padre Pio's approach in the confessional as surgical. He said Padre Pio had once explained to him that a confessor who lets a penitent walk away with comfortable lies is not a shepherd. He is a butcher who lets the sheep walk back into the field bleeding. There is an exchange from 1955 that Father Alessio Parente documented in his account, an exchange between Padre Pio and a woman who told him in confession that she felt nothing when she prayed, that she had felt nothing for years and was beginning to think God did not hear her. Padre Pio asked her if she was still showing up. She said yes. He said, "Then he hears you." The feeling is not the prayer. The prayer is the showing up. But then he paused and asked her why she was showing up. Was she showing up out of habit, out of obligation, out of fear of what would happen if she stopped? Or was she showing up because something in her, however small, however buried, still wanted something from God? She was silent for a long moment. Then she said she was not sure. He told her that honest answer was the best thing she had said in years, and that the moment of not being sure, when it was brought to God directly instead of managed alone, was the beginning of something real. He absolved her. She left the confessional and sat in the church for 2 hours without being able to explain why. Something had shifted. Something that had been stuck for years had moved, even slightly, and she felt it in her body before she understood it in her mind. The evidence of what this sternness produced is striking. Padre Alessio Parente, the Irish Capuchin friar who served as Padre Pio's nurse in the final years of his life, and wrote a first-hand account published in 1984, documented multiple cases of people who were refused absolution, went away wounded, and came back transformed. He recounted one case from the early 1960s, a businessman from Rome who had been refused 3 times over the course of 2 years. Each time Padre Pio looked at him and sent him away without a word, or with a single sentence that made clear he was not ready. The 3rd refusal sent the man into a crisis of faith. He considered leaving the church entirely. He told a priest friend that if even the sacrament of mercy could be withheld, what was the point? That priest friend, whose name is given in Parente's account as Don Felice, wrote him a letter in response that said exactly one useful thing, that the mercy was not being withheld. The mercy was refusing to be wasted on a soul still running from what it needed to face. The businessman came back a 4th time in 1963. He made a confession that lasted, by his own account, over 2 hours. Padre Pio absolved him. The man wept in the church for an hour afterward. He then spent the following decade founding a charitable organization in Rome that served, by 1978, over 4,000 families in poverty. That is what the sacrament does when the window is open. The problem of routine is not simply a problem of emotion or spiritual feeling. Padre Pio was clear about this distinction. He was not saying that every communion needed to feel overwhelming. He was not demanding mystical experience as the price of valid reception. He said explicitly, and this is documented in a conversation recorded by Father Joseph Pius Martin, an American Capuchin, who served at San Giovanni Rotondo and who gave sworn testimony during the beatification cause. He said that consolation in prayer is a gift, not a right, and that many saints received the Eucharist in spiritual dryness for decades, and that was not routine. That was the dark night. It was different. The dark night is an agony of desire. Routine is the absence of desire. The dark night is wanting God and not feeling him. Routine is no longer wanting at all and not noticing. This distinction cuts deep. because it means that the person in spiritual dryness, going through every motion in pain and silence, is in far better shape than the person who goes through every motion contentedly and never notices that anything is missing. The first person is suffering the wound. The second person has gone numb to it. There's a third category worth naming, and Padre Pio addressed it specifically in conversations with Father Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, whose correspondence with Padre Pio runs to hundreds of documented letters. There is the person who knows they have gone cold, feels guilty about it, but does nothing, because they tell themselves the feeling of guilt means they still care. Padre Pio told Father Agostino that guilt alone, without action, is one of the most comfortable spiritual resting places available to a human being. You feel bad enough about the problem to believe you have not fully abandoned it, but not bad enough to actually change. You sit in the guilt like a warm bath, and the years go by. He said there were souls he had seen in 50 years of confessions who had been feeling guilty about their spiritual tepidity for 20, 30, 40 years without it producing a single concrete act of change. He said the feeling of guilt is not contrition. Contrition moves. Contrition does something. Guilt that does nothing is just comfort in a different shape. This is a hard saying. It is also a precisely useful one for anyone who has ever sat in Mass telling themselves they should be more focused, feeling vaguely bad about it, and then leaving the parking lot the same way they entered. That pattern, Padre Pio was saying, is its own trap. The awareness does not free you from it. Action does. And the first action is not a spiritual exercise or a devotional practice. It is a decision made before you even feel like making it. In 1964, 4 years before his death, Padre Pio gave a homily, one of the rare occasions he preached publicly, since his ministry was primarily sacramental, not homiletic, in which he directly addressed the congregation about this numbness. The homily was not recorded verbatim, but Father Eusebio Notte, a friar present, documented its content in his personal diary, which was examined during the beatification process. According to that diary, Padre Pio said something close to this, that he had heard hundreds of thousands of confessions, and that the sin that frightened him most was not the dramatic one, not the violent one, not the one that made men weep with shame. The sin that frightened him most was the one people did not know they were committing, the sin of going through the motions of faith while the soul slowly evacuated the building. He said that hell is not filled only with people who rejected God dramatically. It has a quieter wing too, for people who simply kept doing the right things long after they stopped meaning them. This is not a comfortable theology. It is not the kind of thing that gets put on prayer cards, but it is documented. And it explains why Padre Pio spent 50 years in a confessional rather than at a lectern, because he understood that the sacraments are not automatic machinery, they are encounters. And an encounter requires two presences. God's presence is unconditional. The human presence is the variable. The practical advice Padre Pio gave, and this comes from the collection of his spiritual teachings, compiled by his spiritual director Father Agostino and cross-referenced in the Epistolario volumes, was direct and brief. Before confession, spend at least 15 minutes in genuine examination of conscience, not reciting a list of categories, but actually asking what has kept you distant from God since your last confession, including attitudes, patterns, and the roots beneath the visible sins. Before communion, spend some time in silent anticipation, at minimum from the beginning of the consecration, understanding what is about to happen. After communion, do not immediately pick up a hymnal, do not immediately greet the person next to you. Give the encounter a few minutes to breathe. He said most people walk out of the most intimate moment possible with God and immediately start talking about lunch. He also gave specific advice about what to do when you have already gone cold and do not know how to warm back up. He told people not to wait for the feeling, not to wait until they felt ready or moved or spiritually alive. He said waiting for the feeling to come before you act is exactly backwards. You act first. You kneel. You open the book. You say the words, even dry, even empty, even if they feel like sand in your mouth. Because the act, done honestly and without pretense, is itself the beginning of desire. You cannot manufacture desire by thinking about it. You manufacture it by moving toward the thing you want to want. A man who is hungry does not become hungrier by sitting still. He becomes hungrier by walking toward the kitchen. The movement itself wakes the appetite. He gave this advice to dozens of people across 4 decades. The friar, Father Joseph Pius Martin, who spent years close to him and whose testimony is among the most extensive in the Beatification Positio, recorded that Padre Pio returned to this theme more than almost any other in private spiritual direction. Act first. The feeling follows the act. Do not wait for the feeling before you act. He said he had watched people spend entire decades waiting for the feeling of faith before deciding to practice it, and in those decades, the waiting itself had become their practice. They were practicing waiting. They had gotten very good at it. He was not impressed. He said that the sacraments specifically are designed to meet you in the act, not in the feeling. The confessional is not a place you go when you feel sorry. It is a place you go to become sorry. The altar is not a place you go when you feel love. It is a place you go to receive it. The direction is always from the sacrament toward the soul, not from the soul's readiness toward the sacrament. You do not earn communion by being spiritually ready for it. You receive communion to become spiritually ready for the next moment, and the next, and the one after that. But you have to actually be there. You have to actually open your hands. And opening your hands requires the choice to approach, even when your arms feel like lead. The prayer he gave most frequently to those who struggled with tepidity was not complicated. It was short. He told people to simply say, every morning, something like, "Lord, I know I'm cold. Warm me." He said that was enough, that God does not wait for eloquence, that a soul admitting its own coldness is already in motion toward something. In 1967, the year before he died, a young woman from Naples came to San Giovanni Rotondo. She was 23 years old, had been receiving communion since age 7, 16 years of regular reception, and came to Padre Pio not for confession, but simply to see him. She attended his Mass. Afterward, through the small group allowed proximity to him, she managed a brief exchange. She told him she felt nothing when she received communion, that she had never felt anything, that she was beginning to wonder if something was wrong with her or if faith was real at all. Padre Pio looked at her for a moment. Then he said, and this is recorded in her own written testimony submitted in 1992 to the beatification process. He said, very simply, that the problem was not that she felt nothing. The problem was that she had stopped asking for something. He told her to begin asking every time, before she received, to ask. Just ask, for anything. For warmth, for belief, for the ability to want God. He said that is the crack in the door, and grace does not need much space. She began doing it. She described what followed over the subsequent months, not as a dramatic conversion experience, but as a very slow thaw. Like ice in spring, she wrote. Nothing violent, just a gradual loosening. By the following year, she had entered a religious community. She took vows in 1972. She was still in that community when she gave her testimony 20 years later. The final weeks of Padre Pio's life are worth noting here, because they demonstrate what a lifetime of non-routine sacramental practice looks like at the end. By September of 1968, he was visibly dying. The stigmata wounds that had marked him for 50 years were remarkably closing. By September 20th, 2 days before his death, they had healed completely. No scars, no marks, as though they had never existed. Multiple witnesses, including his physician, Dr. Giuseppe Sala, confirmed this. On September 22nd, his condition deteriorated sharply. He continued to celebrate Mass that morning with visible difficulty. He received communion. He prayed the rosary. He heard one final confession, not gave it, received it, his own, at around 2 a.m. on September 23rd, 1968. He died at 2:30 in the morning. He was 81 years old. Those who were present said that his final Mass the morning before his death had been different. Not dramatic, not visibly extraordinary. But the friar who served it, Padre Pellegrino Funicelli, said in his sworn testimony that it lasted much longer than usual, not because Padre Pio was too weak to move quickly, but because at each prayer he paused, and each pause had a quality of presence, of interior depth, that Padre Pellegrino could only describe as someone fully awake at every word, not going through the motions, the opposite of the motions. 81 years old, dying and still fully there. He had spent 50 years in a confessional precisely to prevent other people from arriving at the end, having never been fully there at all. And here is the detail that closes this story, the one that makes everything else land differently. When the Vatican's Medical Commission examined Padre Pio's body in preparation for his beatification in 2002, they were trying to understand the stigmata scientifically one final time. What they found was that his hands, the same hands that had bled continuously for 50 years, showed no scar tissue consistent with prolonged wounds. They showed no calcification, no fibrosis, no structural damage associated with chronic injury. The wounds had not merely healed, they had left nothing behind, as if they had never been. The medical examiners included this finding in their report without explanation. The wounds were real. The bleeding was documented across 5 decades by multiple physicians, and then they were simply gone. No trace, like something that existed in another register of reality altogether. Real while they needed to be, then perfectly resolved. 5 decades of bleeding hands, nothing left behind. That is what a life of full encounter with the sacraments looks like from the outside. Not a performance, not a routine, something that was genuinely alive, and then when it was finished completely.